Well, it is 5:30 on October 28th, so let's begin our 5:30 business meeting of the Douglas County Board of County Commissioners. We want to welcome any of you who are at the courthouse or joining us online. We just want to pass on a bit of information regarding how we run our meetings on Zoom during this time of social distancing. If visual aids are used during the meeting, the presenter will share the screen with the call. Participants will not be able to view them without a computer, smartphone, or tablet. All participants will be entered into the meeting with their audio muted, meaning the commission and the public will not be able to hear you. Presenters will be unmuted when their agenda item comes up. We ask that all online presenters use good conference call etiquette and mute their line when not speaking. And please introduce yourself each time you speak. If you have a public comment on an agenda item or under regular public comment, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom. Staff will call on you and then unmute you. We ask that speakers give their name and address for the minutes. The county reserves the right to shut off the microphone and remove any speaker from the meeting if they are vulgar, rude, or inappropriate. The chat function has been disabled and a recording of this meeting will be available on our website after the meeting. So tonight's agenda has 4 consent agenda items, 1 regular agenda items, appointments, then we'll do general public comment and commissioner or administrator miscellaneous before we adjourn. With that, commissioners, is there any item that you would like to have removed from the consent agenda for further discussion?
I don't have anything.
Have anything either? Is there any member of the public who would like to remove an item from the consent agenda?
I don't believe we have anyone here for removing anything from the consent agenda.
Thank you. Jill, anyone online?
No.
Jill? With that, I would take a motion for approval of the consent agenda.
Move to approve.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. All right, that will move us to our regular agenda, which is a review of the North Lawrence drainage concerns and proposed stormwater management standards for the unincorporated area of the Maple Grove watershed. And we'll welcome Chad Voigt into our meeting and take it away, Chad.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. You might remember that on September 9th, we reviewed the sod shop site plan and had lengthy discussions about drainage in North Lawrence. And I think there was a discussion about whether or not we should officially adopt a standard as we applied to that site plan. Should that be done on other developments in the watershed in an official standard? There was also interest in sort of a study session sort of discussion about the drainage issues in North Lawrence. And after that, we took that idea and the planning office and I delivered a presentation to the Planning Commission on Monday night, which is the same presentation that I'll give you tonight. And it was well received. It was good for them to see. I think a lot of those folks had never seen some of the information. So I think it was helpful to them to understand how things work in North Lawrence. And I was fortunate to be able to draw on some past experience and explain some of the history there. So with that, I'll share my screen and dive into the presentation that I put together. And then at the end of that, we can talk about steps to go forward to maybe adopt a standard. All right, tell me what you can see. Is that, can you see the presentation view or the PowerPoint view?
We are seeing the PowerPoint view, Chad.
Okay.
Now we're seeing a letter.
Okay. I'm gonna reshare with the other screen if I can. Blue screen.
Yeah, I sort of feel like I'm at the eye doctor here. Yeah, blue screen.
I'll try again.
That looks great.
How's that?
Perfect.
Now we're full screen presentation. Thank you. I always struggle with that. All right. So as I pulled this up 10 minutes ago, I realized it still said Planning Commission, October 26th. So I quickly updated that. You are the Douglas County Commission, October 28th. And Sarah, do we have Jeff Crick or Amy Miller joining us, because they were also in on this?
I don't see them in the attendee list.
Okay, I will attempt to cover their portion of it. What I did here was I prepared sort of a quick outline. First, the watershed maps that I'd like to show and kind of describe the area. Then second was a recap of the North Lawrence drainage study. And then the review of the Northeast sector plan was the part that Amy had prepared, and I can walk through that. And then finally, a discussion of this proposed standard. All right, so just to get oriented, we're obviously talking about the areas in green is Grant Township, and the gray areas are the city limits, including the airport, I-70 cutting across the screen. So everything north of the river within Douglas County. And quickly switching to another view of that same area, this map is our 2006 LIDAR data, the topography that we've got. And I put this in a banded color scheme to emphasize, obviously, the very different characteristics of the area north of the river and the Kansas River Valley passing through North Lawrence. And it's fascinating to kind of sit and study the different marks on the ground from old river scours and river meanders and the changes that are man-made, obviously. So, but the takeaway is that it's a wide river bottom area with flat ground, slow drainage, and a lot of potential flooding. So in 1941, the same area, this is an aerial photo from 41. This would have been at a time when obviously there was no levee. You can see all of the river scours and river meanders from ancient riverbeds that formed in those open areas that we saw in the topography map. And it's, you know, fascinating that the topography is pretty much the same. So changes of that magnitude take some pretty major floods. As you flip through the aerial photos of the years, you can actually see the river move, but nothing like what we can see evidence of in the past. Going to 1954, this would have been 3 years after the 51 flood. You can see some areas that were scoured out and sand exposed throughout the area. One thing to note is all of the small scale agriculture that still existed at the time. It wasn't until the years following this that large scale agriculture really took hold, and you can still see all of those sort of smaller farms throughout that river valley. You can also see the extents of North Lawrence, which are very similar to what we have today. There hasn't been a large amount of development that side of the river to change from what we saw in 1954. 1966, we have the addition of I-70 crossing through that area, and that had some implications for drainage. There were some, the embankment was very tall and obviously changed some of the ways that water flow. And you can start to see that commercial corridor that showed up on 2nd Street there at the Turnpike interchange extending north. So that was a little bit of a bump in impervious surface in the watershed, both the freeway itself and the commercial corridor. And then in 1976, in response to the 51 flood and other major floods, the Corps built the levee system all along the Kansas River from Kansas City all the way upstream, several locations. This is the Lawrence unit. The yellow line outlines the levee that was built. There are 2 pieces to it, the Kansas River piece and then the Mud Creek piece, and they both form this loop that forms basically a bathtub. And even though it was 10 years later, you can see that the growth in North Lawrence was still pretty similar to what existed 10 or 20 years before that. So then overlaying that levee system that was put in place on the river valley, you can see the major effect of that levee on flow. Obviously, it's protecting folks from river flows by forcing those over to the channel, but it's also creating a major blockage, which has impacts on the floodplain. So it's a major change for the Kansas River. It would be a long time before the river would be able to meander again. We'd have to have a levee failure of some kind to see the river change course in the future. Levees are an engineered system, so they require a lot of maintenance and long-term costs, and at some point that levee will be overtopped. So that's something to keep in mind also when you're making planning decisions. Just adding the floodplain to that to show just how dramatic that change is. Also noting that within that levee, there is floodplain, so that's referred to as internal drainage. When you have a bathtub that you've formed and water falls within that, then it's going to collect somewhere. So the floodplain within the levee still does exist on a small scale in low-lying areas. And as you can see, those areas follow the old meanders in the river where the low-lying ground was left. If you want to know more about the levee and what it protects and the length of it and how the city of Lawrence maintains it and what the future holds, there is a national levee database and the levee is in there. So then what I've done is to identify, when we talk about Maple Grove watershed in discussions, tried to show you what that means here. So it's possible to find a relative high ridge that bisects that watershed. And I've done that with this map. And on the left is Maple Grove watershed. And it's named after the Y-shaped tributary there that was known as Maple Grove. That drains down to the 2nd Street pump station in the city of Lawrence, in North Lawrence, and it's pumped through the levee. And the eastern part of this overall watershed is just the original low-lying ground of the Kansas River floodplain. And where that drains to is one of the larger gates that goes through the levee to Mud Creek. And what's interesting is that if there is a major flood event in this side over here on Maple Grove, if it got high enough, it would actually overflow right here and it would enter into this watershed, which it did in 1951. And this is the location of a pond on the east side of the road that was a scour hole formed by the 51 flood. And so that flow path is very evident when you're out there. So there's the 2nd Street pump station in the distance right down there. And this is all part of the storage area for that pump station. And then that extends all the way up into the Maple Grove tributary. And then one final piece is to add in all of these points down here, which are City of Lawrence storm sewer data. It's culverts and ditches and curb inlets and all the things that they maintain within the city. And that's referred to as the internal drainage system in the study that we're going to talk about. You can also see on here multiple levee gates. There are these light blue lines laid over the yellow line. Each one of those is an individual levee gate that lets water out of small ponding areas behind the levee. This is a map that I made a while back that combines soil type with land use cover, and it generates an engineering factor that we use in calculations that basically represents runoff potential. Red is high runoff potential, green is low. And when we talk about preserving those sandy soils, that's one reason that we do focus on the area in North Lawrence, is that in the existing condition, the runoff potential is much lower in that area. When you develop that ground, as you can see along the commercial corridor that runs up Highway 24 and 40, right here, you dramatically change that runoff potential. And if that were the case across a large area of this watershed, you would see dramatic changes in downstream flood conditions. So with that in mind, that's a good sort of segue to the 2005 North Lawrence drainage study. This was commissioned by the Public Works Department when I was with the city, and it was actually requested by the Planning Commission at the time. And that was based on the fact that a lot of developments had come in proposal form and were shut down because of concerns about drainage. And they wanted to know exactly what are the parameters that we're working within here. The first step for the consultant that did the study was to sit down with the planning office. They pulled out Horizon 2020, and then they extended some of those ideas into the future and tried to project what ultimately might this watershed look like if it were allowed to develop. And if you really study this map, you see a picture that is something that we thankfully are not going to have. It's very high numbers of impervious areas and intense development. Red represents a commercial corridor along the highway. The sod shop site would be located right here. So at the discussions they had back in 2005, they thought maybe commercial might work there. Lighter purple is office and research, and dark purple is industrial. At the time, the city had a lot of discussions about where could we put our next industrial park. And ideas of putting that near the airport were floated around. So this was the map that they worked with to sort of compare against when they did the study of what the impacts and what the cost would be for development at the time. And here are the results of that study. The internal system is on the left. That's the storm sewers and other city maintained features that were in the lower left of the watershed. And just to get those to a point where they would not flood houses and where roads would be passable and at acceptable standard, that came to a price tag of $16 million in improvements. And one of the major pieces of that was the pump station had to be upgraded at 2nd Street. On the right is a larger area, and this would involve maybe some county, maybe some township work. This was all of the roads that would serve those developing areas out in Grant Township, several bridges to be replaced, and then a major project to divert water out of North Lawrence rather than letting it enter North Lawrence. That pump station was $11 million, and the total cost of all of those improvements came to $25 million. So this essentially would be the cost of development if that were allowed to continue. Here's a look at one of the many maps from that study that showed the multiple improvements that were recommended within the city of Lawrence in existing areas, commercial and residential. A lot of pipes needed to be replaced. This is where the 2nd Street pump station sits right here, and the recommendation is down here to upgrade that from 107 to 549 cubic feet per second. So basically 5 times the capacity of the existing pump station. A lot of these recommendations actually would be needed under existing conditions if we really want to bring some of those areas up to good standards. So there's money that needs to be spent there, but the idea at the time was that we wouldn't want development to make that a much more imminent need and a much greater expense. This map shows all of the improvements that were recommended out in the unincorporated areas. And there is one option to note. So the pump station that would divert Maple Grove into the river before it runs into North Lawrence would be located roughly here. And it was proposed in 2005 at $11 million. There's an alternative to that, which would be to pick up that tributary and grade a ditch along Highway 2440 that would divert the water over to this side of the watershed and let it flood farm ground and buy easements for that. And that had a lower price tag of $2.5 million. But that would be what would be necessary to allow development up in this direction. So there would be a direct cost of development, a major cost for what at the time really didn't seem to be a large area worth that kind of expense. There was a final piece of the study that we asked for, and it's just sort of precautionary, that what if the levee breached and what would that look like? Since they were doing hydraulic modeling, we asked them to do that. And the assumption was that the most likely levee breach location is back here, and that it would flood into the Maple Grove watershed. It would flood all the low-lying areas it would pass through that point of overflow there at Clark's Pond, and it would enter into this part of the watershed and flood all the way down to the levee. So essentially, if you go back and look at aerial photos in the 1951 flood, they look very much like this. And that's what a levee breach would look like. So while, you know, you can develop in levee protected areas, you always have to ask, you know, what sort of investments is it really wise to make in those areas? All right, and I'll switch real quickly to Amy put together a presentation for the Northeast Sector Plan, which I'll do a poor job of sharing, but I'll give it a shot here. Can you see that? The Northeast Sector Plan. How about now?
No.
Okay. Oh, I hit pause, sorry. Resume share, that's the button I needed. Can you see it now?
No.
No Northeast Sector Plan?
Still the PowerPoint.
Okay. So it's grabbing that, okay. Interesting. That should work. Have
There
you
you
got
go.
Northeast? Yep, good. So this is a PDF copy of what Amy presented. So the Northeast Sector Plan was adopted in 2012, and it was at the time it you know, made use of some of the findings from the 2005 drainage study, and it did not look anything like the long-range map that was used in that study. She outlined here that it covers this area, essentially the same area that we've been talking about there in Grant Township. And that's a larger area than most of the other sector plans. So this was a unique in that way. And at the time it was 72% agricultural and existing zoning. I'm having a hard time seeing it too now. Okay, so yeah, a lot of floodplain, and you might, if you know the floodplain in that area, you might notice that this floodplain is actually larger than what we have today. There was a levee certification project that was done in 2010, and then later FEMA updated the maps to actually reduce some of the floodplain. But the point is that a lot of that area up there is floodplain. And then class 1 and 2 soils, we've talked about high value soils throughout that area. And then of course, the airspace overlay zones of the airport have an impact on how things can develop in that area as far as height. And we've also talked about birds in standing water. So the wildlife, FAA wildlife mitigation buffer area. And what the plan recommended was limited urban development. They wanted it to be primarily along those major highways. And the future land use in the Northeast Sector Plan is shown like this. And the agriculture is the hatched area in green, covering almost all of it. There's the KU has some research property that's the polka dot colors, and then some existing areas that are developed and a little bit of industrial property allowed to expand along the highway. But basically the sector plan says that primarily the whole area will be agriculture, all of it that has not developed. So with that very engineering minded view of planning, let's see if I can fire this other one back up. And you see my presentation again?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And too much technology, I'm sorry. Every time I get it up, it takes it away from you. Okay, I'm gonna find it.
We got it.
You still have it?
Yep.
All right, thank you. All right, so with the Saw Chop site plan, we had all that history behind us, and it was proposed at 1900 Road right here, and it was a fairly intense amount of impervious surface with a lot of gravel surfacing, and it was located in an area that the Northeast Sector Plan had said should remain agricultural. As you might remember, it was very nearly an agriculturally exempt use. But it was reviewed as a site plan based on the fact that it had an office in the building. With that in mind, we worked with the applicant to develop a method of mitigating the impacts of that additional impervious surface. And flipping to the site plan, that was to store water in an area of the site plan and not release that water at all and let that infiltrate into the ground over several days. And the idea is that in this part of our county, we've got soils that are able to infiltrate water if you can get to the high rates of infiltration down below the ground. So we worked with the applicant to meet a standard, and in summary, you've seen this before, for these different blue amounts of rainfall. The green was the existing amount of runoff, and this is in inches. So it'd be for 2.97 inches, basically 3 inches of rainfall. That's 3 inches over the entire area that you're observing. 3 inches over that area results in 1.4 inches over that area that runs off in the existing condition. If we allowed the development to be built uncontrolled, it jumped up to this 1.76. With our proposed standard, the runoff from the site is 1.13. So at these different levels, this is essentially the 2-year event, the 10-year event, and the 100-year event. The goal was that this 100-year event, existing runoff and proposed with controls are basically the same. And that's the definition that we put forward in this standard. In the smaller storms, it actually had more of a benefit. You've seen that before. This is the same information, just looked at a different way. This is runoff over time, referred to as a hydrograph. The black line is the existing site peaking right here. And all of the area under the curve is the whole volume of runoff from the site. And when you look at that 2nd Street pump station receiving large volumes of water from the watershed to the north, you don't want to add volume to that. And that's the area under the curve. So if we allow the site to develop uncontrolled, the red line is what we would get. It's a higher peak, which affects the first half mile or so downstream from the site by overloading ditches and eroding culverts. But more significantly, it's a higher volume across the board. There's additional runoff above the black line all the way up to here. So all of that additional is what would head for the 2nd Street pump station and create problems. The orange line is our proposed standard, and immediately you can see that we're allowing a higher peak because that's not really our concern in this area. What we've done is we've stored a bunch of water at the start of the storm at the beginning of this curve under the black line so that we can allow a little more to happen during the peak. And the net result is the total volume has been matched to pre-development conditions. And then just as a point of additional information, I added this other double black line on here, which would be the city of Lawrence detention standard, which would dramatically shave off the peak, but it would have no effect on volume. There's all this additional volume being released. And this is the same document that I showed you when we talked about the standard during that site plan review. Just real quickly to run through it. It would be applicable within Maple Grove watershed, which is that piece to the left in the North Lawrence watershed. And if you add impervious surface in that area on a site that requires site plan review, then you have to provide a storage basin to hold the difference in runoff generated for the 100-year storm event. We say that we want to do that with HEC HMS, which is a particular computer model. It's free, it's very easy to use. We would use NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall data, which is the current standard. And we would use methods within the model that are long-term methods that we've been using forever. NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. TR55 was developed in the 1980s. All right, number 3, if soil properties allow, then retained runoff must be infiltrated into the ground within 96 hours. That was what we achieved with the sod shop site plan. If you do not have the soils in place, then you have to have a very small outlet to limit the outflow to 72 hours. So we're trying to mimic having that volume restrained so much that the Second Street pump station can clear out water before it sees that volume. And number 5, the entire developed site must drain to the basin that you're using to control. That's just trying to make sure that there aren't any tricky things going on with the site plan. And then just a statement that once that basin is full, you can let the runoff go. We have to be able to build it, so report dimensions and then add notes to the plan so that in the future people know why it's there and how it's to be maintained. That was the standard we came up with, and it seemed to be a pretty good, effective approach. Working with the applicant, they were easily able to do that. And then you might recall that last week, we applied the same standard to Pine Nursery and achieved some storage on that site to mitigate areas. So we went to the Planning Commission on Monday. We're here tonight to talk to you. And what we would like to do is ask that on November 18th, we can come back to you and have a formal hearing and adoption of this proposed standard for Maple Grove watershed. And that is all I have got. Do you have any questions?
Hey Chad, this is Nancy. Just on your last point, the idea that the larger ditches and kind of temporary water storage structures that would go alongside development, that the water is expected to infiltrate within 90 hours, but if not, then the water could be released essentially out into the watershed again. What if the watershed is still saturated and flooded? I mean, where is it just the water that's been collected is just, I guess it's just part of the.
Well, if we were at a, sorry, if we, since we have chosen a 100-year event for the design basis, we're holding a pretty significant number for that 72 hours. If we exceed that 100-year event, then we've exceeded the standard that people are held to generally. That's kind of what you're describing is if everything's so saturated that that's not good enough, then we probably had a problem anyway.
Mm-hmm. Do you think so? And I guess that's kind of where I'm going, and this would be a huge shift in thinking, but with flood events increasing in numbers of times per year, and in the kind of we do exceed the 100-year event fairly frequently, and certainly the 500-year events are coming more frequently than we are used to. And so I guess I'm wondering what does it take to change that standard to, so that you're, I mean, is that something that a county can work toward, to have kind of the acknowledgement that climate change is shifting the way our storm events are happening, and that flooding is more likely, more frequent, more severe?
Well, in 2014, NOAA updated the rainfall data, and there were some increases across the board. And I think that they would continue to do that, maybe in another decade to, I mean, if there are observed changes, they would need to update their data. And that's really the best way to get at this. I think saying that 100-year event is your agreed standard for community planning, it's something that we should probably keep in place, that level of event, and then just increase over time if the data is shifting, increase the actual numbers we put in. It is a pretty good standard. It's the standard that FEMA maps are based on. It's the standard that people build to when they get a floodplain permit. So if you are near the floodplain and did not need to get a floodplain permit, then if we get a larger storm, there's a potential you could flood. It's kind of that line in the sand that we've drawn in terms of planning and engineering for communities. The 100-year event is that line. So yeah, the rainfall data will shift over time, as they've done.
Well, and I guess that's to be expected. The shame of it is that in those intervening years, we'll have allowed development that then will find itself in trouble.
Right.
We kind of can foresee it happening, but we don't kind of work proactively to prevent that. So I think there could be some looking back on these years as maybe, maybe not being aggressive enough in terms of what's coming, and acknowledging that and building to that. But I understand the limitations. I guess it's just, I would hope as people consider development out in this very floodplain, flood prone area, that very future view of things would be kind of an overlay on top of the standards we're putting in. So
Chad, my question is sort of takes off from where Nancy just left off, which is, it's interesting to see how sector plan adjusted from based on the 2005 study. And, that sector plan was developed with none of these conditions in place. And is it time to I know it's only 4 years later, but do we need to think more about that sector plan and what I sort of feel like this is the standards you've got here are when we're really at a pinch point. So like for the sod shop, for example, it was very close to being an accessory use of an agricultural property, and that may be a better application of these standards. What I'm a little worried about is putting these standards in and we start to see pressure for development that uses these standards, and that development really wasn't designed for that area, but they're using these standards to get to that development. Does that make some sense? I mean,
it absolutely does. There was a similar question at the Planning Commission Monday night about, can a developer take a quarter section of ground and put in one great big basin and then say, okay, well, everything in this quarter section of ground is buildable now. And, the Northeast sector plan intended for this to be agriculture, and that's really what needs to be followed. This is sort of, what do we do if we get in those pinch points? And it shouldn't be used to justify development. And the analogy I gave is the FEMA maps. When they were drawn, it gave people this line where they knew they could build right up to that line. And a lot of times people's common sense was actually better than what the FEMA maps came out to tell them. And it would have been better to not go up to that line. And so in some ways, the FEMA maps enabled development in the floodplain. And so, being able to fill and get away with building those areas was the unintended consequence of FEMA regulations. So it's similar, and you're right. If you say, well, now we can take this and make it all work, and that's not the case. The good thing is it would be very hard to do large scale infiltration. This standard will be tough. I mean, you know, you've got to be able to get to the sandy soil. You've got to maintain it. It's got to be big enough. So I think but the first line of defense is, and this is a point that I tried to make Monday night, was, you know, keeping the agricultural uses in place is the intent of the Northeast Sector Plan. That should be the first line of defense. And, you know, avoidance is really your best watershed tool. And then this would be a more mechanical kind of tool if you need it.
So, Commissioner Kelly, I really appreciate you asking that question, because that was my next concern. I think it's important that we have these standards for those particular ag-related, ag business-related developments that we say we want out there. But I do worry that this is going to be perceived as kind of a can-do attitude now at the county, that we can make development work out there. And that this might be perceived as a welcome mat. And really, I think it's going to come down to you, Chad, and to the Zoning and Codes Department, and to the Planning Department at the City of Lawrence, and in Douglas County Planning Department, and the Planning Commission to stick to the original intent of the Northeast Sector Plan, which is, you know, it wasn't just a pretty vision, you know, to keep this area in ag. It's largely to protect North Lawrence and protect the taxpayers from the enormous cost of inappropriate development, let alone the loss of really invaluable agricultural soil. So this is serious stuff, and I guess that's my concern. And so, Patrick, I'm really glad that you see that as a concern, because that's going to need to be an ongoing attitude, as I think people see an almost nearly acre large, a football field large building being built on that corner with a couple of drainage ponds, you know, holding ponds beside it. That's going to seem like a pretty prime piece of development property out there now. So.
The 2005 study was, you know, the discussion of development paying for itself and what would it take to apply that principle to this area. And it was real clear that the diversion pump that was needed at Highway 24 was the sort of cornerstone of being able to develop farther north. So if somebody came in and said, well, we want to put an industrial park up there, the fallback, I think, is then you need to put this infrastructure in place to offset that impact, because the county isn't going to do it. The township's obviously not going to do it. The city would need it. So that at the time, that was the discussion around the 2005 study, was let's make sure that we don't allow development if development isn't funding the impact that it would have.
Yeah, and I guess I would also say, every time we talk about the costs that the North Lawrence drainage study projects, that $16 million for inside North Lawrence, and then $25 million in Grant Township, those are 2005 dollars as well. So 15 years later, can't even imagine what those numbers would be now.
Chad, would it provide more protection? You know, I guess to what Commissioner Thellman said just a little while ago about, you know, I was compelled, I don't want to get into defending my vote on the sod shop. That's not my interest here. But you know, when we looked at those management standards, it actually got below what it would have been undeveloped, right? The runoff rate when you show your little charts there, it actually got better. Is there any benefit to writing these in a way that we know that they are only applied to agriculture property, agriculture uses? Does that make sense? So that we are saying very clearly, do not apply these to a commercial or an industrial. This is not available for a commercial or industrial request. And we can, or even a residential request, I guess that would also fall into that. It just seems like there's a way to narrow. I want to keep this narrow. That one situation that we problem solved, I don't want to then now cause a domino in this giant bathtub to make the situation worse. And I'm looking for a way to narrow it even more.
The sod shop was a site plan review because it tipped past agricultural into something more intense. So, we don't review site plans for agricultural uses. And it would take an engineer to develop this standard into a site. So I don't know that there's a step in the process if it's just applying to agriculture where we would actually insert this and review it. And then the question is, what would we need then for, another commercial site on Highway 24?
Yeah, I always worry about the long-term ramifications of decisions made today, and will people know what the intent of this was? This was something we created for one property, and it worked for the Pine development as well. I want to be thoughtful about that. There may not be an answer for that. It may be that our current practices work, but I just want to think about it a little bit. I'm glad you're not asking us to approve anything this evening, because I think the public needs more time to churn on this. Did the Kaw Valley Drainage District take a look at this as well?
John Nitcher was observing the meeting Monday night, and I had an email from him following that, and he appreciated the information and had questions about actually the Mud Creek gate outflow, and wanted to know more about that too. But yeah, they were listening in. This is an engineering tool. I think the larger questions that you're asking would go to some way to shore up the Northeast Sector Plan implementation. Is it, defining more specifically what the long-range plan is for that area? Is it absolutely limiting some of those areas to agricultural no matter what? But that's kind of more in the planning realm, and more decisions for you to make.
And this is Sarah. The only thing I'd add from that perspective is that, I think what we've seen now is, I think, an ag use isn't necessarily a pervious service. And I think that's a huge, our brain just thinks about agriculture uses as farm fields, and that's not necessarily the case. But our ability to restrict and require certain requirements to ag properties our hands are really tied in a lot of areas. So, I guess I don't want to underestimate how valuable this will be for ag related businesses. This will be very, very helpful.
And I want to say that I agree with that. And my reference back to the football field sized rooftop that's going to appear out there is not to go back and relitigate that decision. That was a hard decision, but that was an ag business, and the North Lawrence or the Northeast Sector Plan saw the value of ag businesses as a way to kind of maintain that river bottom land and that, to give folks a way to keep their ag businesses and their farms alive by diversifying and kind of encouraging that as a real agricultural sector. So it makes sense. But I think your idea that we need to have some way of saying that this is a way to add a tool to the agricultural development of the area is important, and just to really somehow try and think of a way to enforce the notion, and for good reason, that the vast majority of Grant Township and that agricultural valley really ought to be left to ag just for its natural flood infrastructure value and for all sorts of reasons. We know from the citizen survey that people want to have an urban ag fringe. That's something that cities want now. It's not considered a disadvantage to have agriculture on your urban edge. It's a high value thing that we're lucky to have. It's really a good conversation to have. I'm hopeful that the future commission and future planners and all of y'all will keep all of that in mind.
Any other questions for Chad, commissioners? I think I might have froze there for just a second. So let's open it up for public comment. Sarah, is there anyone?
Yes, we do have someone here for public comment. Do you want to talk, Ted? All right, so come on. I'm gonna turn this around so that you can see him. Yeah, you can stand there. Can you see their little? So I tell you, Chad, could you remove your share screen? There, that's a little better.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement Association. Thank you for letting me come up here and speak on behalf of the 3,000 residents that live in North Lawrence. And 80% of the homes in North Lawrence are owner occupied. And we want to see an event like 1993 again. And there was no development out there at that time. And all the water that came down North 2nd Street, Maple Grove Drainage District, came from north, the airport around Hams Quarry and all around up in there. So that being said, we look at it this way. The development out there is mainly floodplain, and I was taught not to build in a floodplain. Back in the mid-90s, though, the city thought it was a good idea in North Lawrence to do that. And they let the developers build houses on toadstools in North Lawrence and said that was going to take care of the drainage problem. The only thing that did was flooded out the established residents that had been there 50 years, 7,500 years, and we still have that runoff from those homes. They also dug the ditches wider and deeper to nowhere. We didn't have no pump. Well, we waited 20 years for a pump on 6th and Maple, and hallelujah, it does a hell of a job. But it only takes about half of the water out of North Lawrence because the ditches aren't directed to the pump. And that's the city's responsibility because they said they were going to redirect those in-house. It would be cheaper and they could do it quicker. Well, that combined with north of us out at the airport, the more development you have out there, the more water we're going to have in here. And North 2nd Street pump is already overwhelmed when we have a severe rain. And I've heard a 100-year event mentioned. Well, we've had a few of those, 2018, matter of fact, and 19. How much rain we had. If it wasn't for that pump on Maple Street, those people in the basin of North Lawrence would be flooded just like they were previous 20 years waiting for that pump. Now you want to let development happen to the north of us. So you're going to pave over type 1, type 2 soil, build in a flood-prone area, and are you going to wait 20 years before you put a pump in to pump the water to the river? That's what the residents want to know, 3,000 of us. And so we'd like to know what's going to happen to the north of us. And, you know, it looks like if you're going to let development happen out there, it needs to be really sparse, far between, and also need to put the pump in, not after the development, but before the development. So need to get the infrastructure done first before you let the development start. So that's our opinion on this developing north of us. And really, we just like to leave it alone, agricultural, you know, North Lawrence Improvement, Nancy Thelman, and Grant Township worked on that Northeast Sector Plan for 2.5 years and got it the way it is right now. And we'd like to keep it that way. So I think the only other development that could happen out there without being agricultural would be the airport, and it has to be aviation. So anyway, that's North Lawrence's thought on this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Appreciate you coming.
That's all we have here, Commissioner.
Thank you. Jill, anybody online?
No, I'm not seeing anyone, but just another reminder to use the raise your hand function if you would like to make public comment. Not seeing anybody.
Great, thank you. So there's a motion to consider setting the November 18th, 2020 date for hearing and adoption of proposed stormwater management standards for unincorporated areas of Maple Grove watershed. That's just a hearing. We're not approving anything tonight. We're just setting a hearing date for that, and then we can determine at that meeting whether we want to approve these or not. I'll go ahead and make that motion. Is there a second there?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passes 3-0. Chad, thank you very much for all the work on that. I appreciate the historical perspective. I think that's really helpful, and those aerial photos really help, I think, me and I hope the public to understand what the challenge is in that former riverbed. So thanks for
Great.
that.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to appointments is next on our agenda. Commissioners, do we have appointments this evening? Okay, we'll move on to general public comment. General public comments held at the end of each meeting with a limit of 1 comment per person. The commission reserves the right to place a time limit of 3 minutes per speaker if desired. Individuals may not give unused time to other speakers. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss or debate, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented during this time. Rather, they would refer these items to staff for follow-up if necessary. All comments should be directed at the county commission. Sarah, is there anyone there to provide general public comment?
We don't have anyone tonight.
Thank you. Jill, anyone online? Doesn't look like it.
No, sorry.
That's okay. All right, and then we'll close the general public comment and we'll move it to Commissioner and Administrator Miscellaneous. Sarah, let's start with you.
Sorry about that. Took me a while to find my unmute button. Commissioners, thank you. Your weekly memo is included in the packet. Not necessarily a whole lot of updates to it from what we've had in recent weeks in terms of just the various ribbon cuttings and events that we've got coming up here over the next several weeks. There is a legislative update from Little Government Relations included in there. So I would just encourage that we are working with Stuart Little and his team to develop a to work on platform development for the upcoming legislative session. And I stand for any questions.
Sarah, is there any way you could get emergency management to make sure we have good weather on Monday for our Van Gogh mural unveiling?
Monday's supposed to be beautiful.
There we go. See, so the answer is yes.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed.
If we could have Robin on that one appointment for the community corrections, remove that information about Melissa Johnson is eligible for reappointment, since she's not interested in reappointment. And that way it'll look maybe more inviting or welcoming. And then my apologies, commissioners, I did not have Pam send that information on that position out, but I will get it to Sarah and have Sarah get it to you tomorrow in case you know someone who might be interested.
I appreciate that, Commissioner Drew. So I think I do have someone who's interested. So if we could get that, that'd be great.
I will do it right after this meeting.
And I'll also, the work session that we've got planned on 11/18, we've kind of got a different name for it now. So I'll make sure that Daviana gets that updated in the memo, along with the information about the Community Corrections Board.
Thank you.
Any other miscellaneous items, commissioners?
I just have a brief follow-up. Commissioner DeRusso had asked for a report on the Humanities Kansas presentation that our panel, our Farm Stress You Are Not Alone panel did last week, early last week in Onega, Kansas. The panel was made up of Brad Dirks, who's associated with the K-State Behavioral Health Projects. He's a program director. And then Carrie Britt as both our county PIO, but also someone who has lived through suicide of a family member and has come out the other end as a real advocate and educator in that situation. And then Mallory Meek, who is our extension agent, who helped create the resources and did a lot of the background work, and then has created a whole web of tools and resources throughout the state through the extension system. So we had, all things considered, because we had a COVID-safe environment, everyone had to wear masks, everyone had to be socially distanced. Small town, mostly a farming community, but we had a conflict with the Chiefs game. So we had a few things working against us. People showed up anyway, and there were good questions. And actually, some of the farmers there shared stories of their own depression and even their thoughts about suicide, given their situation as farmers. And so it was really, there were a lot of good after conversations, and so I was encouraged by the willingness of farmers and their families to come out and share and listen. And we learned some things about how we need to present that topic with communities who, different from Douglas County, but to make the information really accessible. They did a great job of making sure that there was a mental health provider, a nurse there from the community. And so any issues that needed follow-up, she was there to do. And then we also, Humanities Kansas gives a stipend every time you travel to give a presentation. And so we we're given a $300 stipend that our panel has donated to Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ, our headquarters, and we'll continue to do that as we get to go out for the next year, or maybe year and a half or so. We'll do our best to get as many presentations as possible, and hope to keep steering that money toward headquarters.
Thanks for the update, and that's wonderful to hear that you had a good turnout, and thank you also for donating your stipend to KSPHQ. So that's appreciated. So yeah, I'm glad with the ever-changing chief schedule, you never know what day they're going to be playing. So I'm glad to hear that people still came out, and you know, on one hand, you're sorry to hear that there are, you know, farmers out there that are struggling in that way, but it's good to hear that you were there and they took advantage of coming to listen and talk, and so thank you.
I don't have anything, but I want to thank Commissioner Thelman for her words at the groundbreaking on, gosh, I forget what day it was. It was cold. It was very cold. But I just thought your comments were just really, really nice, and really, really, really grateful for your thoughtful words on that groundbreaking. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for using the love word. That's
That's
you're
great.
right. People do steer clear of it, but there's a lot of times where that's just the best word, and people are afraid to use it. So thank you for.
It's wonderful. And I hope people will join us at the cottages next Friday. Is that right? A week from Friday? Yes. And Van Gogh on Monday. So anything else, commissioners? Staff, Sarah? All right. Well, thank you very much. Another great meeting. We are adjourned.